The palace woke slowly. It always did, servants moving through the stone corridors before the candles burned down, the smell of bread from the kitchens below, the sound of boots on wet cobblestones in the courtyard, the ordinary machinery of a court morning. No one paid attention to the Duke of Verl crossing the east wing at dawn. He was always moving. He was always purposeful. He had been a fixture of this palace for so long that the younger servants had stopped seeing him the way you stop seeing furniture. He was 70 years old, and he walked like a man who owned the floor beneath his feet. Lord Keeper Thomas Brecht was still pulling on his coat when the knock came. He opened the door expecting a page. He found the Duke instead, standing very still, holding nothing, his pale eyes calm and settled the way a frozen lake is calm. "The archive," the Duke said, "now." Brecht did not ask questions. He had learned long ago that questions cost more than silence. They walked together through the lower corridor that connected the servants' passage to the records hall. The Duke's footsteps were even and unhurried. Brecht's were slightly faster, which required him to adjust every few meters to avoid getting ahead of a man who had no intention of being led. The archive smelled of old paper and beeswax and something faintly metallic, the smell of a room that held too much history and too little air. The Duke placed his hands on the reading table. He did not sit. "The Liber Aureus," he said. Brecht lifted the book from its cabinet, a wide, heavy volume bound in dark leather with gold edging along the spine, the royal crest pressed into the cover with a depth that had never faded. He set it on the table. He stood back. The Duke opened it himself. He turned the pages with the slow, deliberate care of a man who had handled this book many times, not gently exactly, but with the specific confidence of ownership. He found the entry for Countess Alara Vassenthorn without searching. He had known the page number before he arrived. He read it once, then he spoke. The entry was long birth date, parentage, the marriage to Count Vassenthorn, the title transfer upon his death, the land holdings confirmed by court ruling 3 weeks prior, the legal notes appended in smaller script. It took 4 minutes to read aloud. Brecht wrote beside it as the Duke spoke, his pen moving in careful practice strokes. At the end, the Duke said one word. "Nullified." Brecht wrote it in the margin. His pen paused for a moment, just a breath, and then continued. The word sat there in fresh, wet ink. A small word, it weighed nothing, it unmade everything. The Duke closed the book. He did not thank Brecht, he left. Brecht stood alone in the archive with the closed Liber Aureus on the table in front of him, and a feeling in his stomach he could not quite name. He carried the book back to its cabinet. He locked the cabinet. He stood for a long moment in the quiet of the room. He thought about a letter he had seen 3 weeks ago, not read because it was sealed, because it was not his to read, but he had carried it. From the Countess's secretary to the Queen's personal correspondence desk. A letter among other letters. Nothing unusual about it except the weight. It had been unusually heavy for a single page. He picked up his coat. He went to find breakfast. He moved a little faster than usual and told himself it was the cold. The rose garden in the east courtyard held the morning sun longer than the rest of the palace grounds. The Countess knew this. She had chosen it on purpose. She was sitting on the stone bench with a cup of warm cider and a book she was not reading when the young page found her. He was perhaps 16, pink-cheeked from hurrying, and he held the document out with both hands the way young people hold things they sense are important without knowing why. She set down the cider. She took the document. She read it. It was a formal decree, stamped with the Duke's private seal, citing his authority as keeper of the royal registry. The language was precise, legalistic, bloodless, the kind of language designed to sound like procedure rather than punishment. Her name had been removed from the Liber Aureus. Her title was suspended pending legal review. Her claim to the land confirmed by the court 3 weeks prior was, pending the same review, frozen. She read it twice, not because she had not understood it the first time, because she wanted to be sure about the date and time stamped at the bottom. Dawn, he had done it at dawn. She had hoped he would wait until spring, hoped, though she had not truly expected it. He was a man who liked to end things before the court was fully awake, before the day had offered anyone a chance to interfere. She set the document on the bench beside her, with the same care one uses to set down a piece of porcelain that belongs to someone else. She had known this was coming for 6 months. Not guessed, known. The whisper network of this court moved through ladies' chambers and dressing rooms, and the slow conversations between women who had survived multiple regimes by knowing things before they needed to act on them. She had heard the Duke's intentions from 3 separate sources before the summer had ended. She had not panicked. She had not confronted him. She had done something more useful. She had written a letter. Not to the Duke, to the Queen. The letter had discussed grain tariffs in the northern provinces. It was detailed, accurate, and genuinely useful. Vasenthorn understood northern taxation better than most of the men on the Queen's Council because she had been managing land in the north for 14 years and had actual numbers, not estimates. The Queen had written back. They had corresponded 6 times over 4 months on agricultural taxation, supply routes, and winter pricing. The 7th letter had contained something extra. 14 pages, hand-annotated, sealed separately inside the main envelope. A legal brief. 14 years of accumulated documentation showing that the original patent of nobility granted to the Duke's grandfather in 1638 had been falsified, witness signatures forged, a land survey altered, a key date in the church registry changed by a single digit in a different ink. The brief had been assembled over years, sourced from a monastery archive in the north that had maintained its own copy of documents the Duke's family had assumed were lost. The Countess had sent it without comment, no explanation, no threat, no request. The Queen was not a woman who needed things explained to her. Vasenthorn finished her cider. It was cold now. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and walked back toward the palace at the same pace she always walked. No hurry, no visible change in her expression. She had not started this. She had simply made sure she was prepared for when it started. The Queen received the news of the erasure during her morning audience, a room full of petitioners, minor officials, one very nervous merchant from the southern trade districts, and a young nobleman presenting a complaint about fishing rights on a disputed river boundary. She was listening carefully to the nobleman when her secretary appeared at the edge of the room and waited. She knew from the way he was standing that it had happened. She finished listening to the fishing rights complaint. She asked 3 clarifying questions. She ruled in the young nobleman's favor and cited the relevant statute from memory, which made him blink. She thanked the merchant for his patience. She poured herself more tea from the pot on the side table. It was still hot, which pleased her, and then she turned to her secretary. He told her in 4 sentences. She listened to all 4. "Has Lord Keeper Brecht returned to the archive?" she asked. "Yes, Your Majesty." She was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that was not the absence of thought but the presence of it, a room being tidied, not emptied. "Send for the legal secretariat," she said, "the 3 senior clerks, bring the Memoria Regia from the vault. And tell them to bring the 1638 land registry correspondence." She paused. "The monastery copies, not the palace copies." Her secretary understood the difference. He moved quickly. For a man who had worked in this palace for 22 years, he moved very quickly. The legal inquiry took 40 minutes. This was not because it was rushed. It was because the evidence was not complicated once it was laid out correctly, and Vasenthorn's brief had laid it out correctly, with a clarity that suggested she had been imagining this exact room, this exact table, these exact 3 clerks for some time. Every document was referenced, indexed, and cross-checked against the monastery copies that the Duke's family had never known existed. The original patent of 1638 was fraudulent. Not questionable, not disputed, fraudulent. The witness signatures belonged to 2 men who, according to church death records, had both died 6 months before the date on the document. The land survey had been altered. The change was visible under lamplight if you held the page at the correct angle, which Vasenthorn's notes told the clerks to do on page 4 of her brief. The registry date had been changed from 1638 to 1639, altering the order of inheritance in the Duke's grandfather's favor. The senior clerk read the final summary aloud. He had a flat, careful voice trained for precision. The conclusion was 2 sentences. The patent was void. Every title and right derived from it had no legal foundation. The Queen listened. She set down her pen. "Then we correct the record," she said. This was not a dramatic statement. She said it the way one says a practical thing, the way one says the roof needs mending or the accounts need reviewing. The clerks began to write. The Memoria Regia was an old book, older than the Liber Aureus, bound in plain brown leather with no crest and no gilding. It did not look important. It was perhaps the most important document in the palace. Every grant of royal recognition, every confirmed patent, every formal acknowledgement of a noble family standing before the crown, all of it recorded here in the sovereign's own register. The entry for the Duke of Verl occupied a full page. His father occupied half a page. His grandfather, the original, occupied 3 lines. Those 3 lines were the root of everything. A clerk with a very small blade and a very steady hand removed them, not crossed out, not written over, removed the paper, lifted carefully, the surface smoothed, the page repressed until the area where the entry had been was clean and unmarked. His grandfather had never received a valid patent. His father had inherited nothing. The Duke had built 70 years of power on a foundation that, as of this morning, the law recognized as heir. The entry for the Duke himself was removed in the same way. Then quietly, with fresh ink in Brecht's slightly unsteady handwriting, the entry for Countess Alara Vassenthorn was restored to the Liber Aureus. Correct title, correct lands, the court ruling from 3 weeks prior confirmed and appended. The brief note at the bottom, added by the senior clerk, cited the legal nullification of the erasure issued that morning on the grounds that the authority used to make it had itself been found to have no valid legal standing. It was, in the language of the law, as if the erasure had never occurred. It was, in practical terms, considerably worse for the Duke than that. The Duke was in his carriage. He had spent the morning attending to 2 other pieces of business, a meeting with a land agent about a property in the West, a short correspondence with a cousin about a family matter, and was traveling between them when the palace messenger caught up with the carriage on the main road. The messenger was young. He stopped the carriage with more confidence than he felt, and handed the sealed document up to the Duke's steward through the window. The steward broke the seal. He began to read aloud as was custom. He stopped after the 3rd sentence. The Duke took the document from him. He read it himself, all of it slowly, from the formal citation at the top to the clerk's signature at the bottom. The legal language was clear, and there was nothing in it that required a second reading for comprehension. He understood it perfectly the first time. He understood that his title had been found to have no valid origin. He understood that his authority over the Liber Aureus, which derived entirely from that title, was retroactively void. He understood that the erasure he had carried out that morning had therefore been carried out by a private citizen with no legal standing to act on the registry, making it not a legal act but a falsification. He understood that Alara Vassenthorn's name, as a result, had not merely been restored but had never, in the legal sense, been successfully removed. He sat very still in the carriage for a long time. Outside, the messenger was waiting. The steward was looking at the floor of the carriage. The horses stood patient and dumb in the morning light. "We will draft an appeal," the Duke said finally. "To whom, your Grace?" the steward asked. The Duke did not answer immediately. He was thinking about the address. An appeal required a title on the letter. A title required legal standing. Legal standing required a valid patent. "We will draft a letter," he said instead, a different word. He began composing it in his head on the drive back to the palace. Careful language, measured, citing 40 years of service to the crown, the established custom of the title, the practical reality of continuity. He had written letters like this before, not for himself but for others. He knew how they were structured. He knew what language moved secretariats and what language moved courts. He filed 3 petitions for an audience over the following month. Each one was received by the palace. Each one was logged by a junior clerk in the incoming correspondence register under the name listed in the petition's header. Each one was then, without malice, without any written explanation, without a single unkind word added to the record, filed under a category the clerks had quietly created for this purpose: correspondence from private citizens with no current legal standing before the crown. Not rejected, not denied, filed. The distinction mattered enormously to the law. In practical terms, the effect was identical. The Countess dined alone that evening. She ate the same meal she would have eaten regardless of how the day had gone: bread, a soft cheese, roasted root vegetables with rosemary, a glass of the red wine she had been having delivered from a vineyard in the south for 11 years. She read a little. She wrote 2 letters, one regarding a drainage matter on her northern land, one responding to her niece, who had asked for advice on a property question. Both letters were practical and reasonably warm. She did not write to the Queen. There was nothing to say. The matter had been handled correctly. The Queen did not need to be thanked for doing what was right, and the Countess did not need to be acknowledged for having made it possible. They understood each other in the specific way that two careful people understand each other when they have both, at different moments, chosen the same side without coordinating it aloud. She blew out the candle at a reasonable hour. She slept well. Brecht also slept well, which he mentioned to his wife the next morning with a faint air of surprise. She did not ask why. She had been married to him for 26 years, and she understood that there were days in the archive when things happened that he could not discuss, and that the best response was breakfast. He ate 2 portions of eggs. He went back to work. The archive was orderly. The Liber Aureus was in its cabinet. The monarchy continued. No one who passed Brecht in the corridor that morning would have guessed that the previous day had been anything other than a routine Tuesday in a palace full of routine Tuesdays. That was the thing about real power. It did not announce itself. It did not raise its voice. It did not leave evidence of effort or drama or struggle. It simply moved quiet and precise and already several steps ahead, and when you finally looked up to see what had happened, the ground beneath you had already changed, and the woman who changed it was already thinking about drainage problems and the price of winter grain. The Duke had believed for 70 years that the pen was more durable than the crown. He had built his entire life on that belief. He had used ink to build, to defend, to punish, and finally to strike, and he had been right every time, against everyone he had ever used it against. He had simply never used it against someone who had been holding a better pen, and waiting, and watching, and being patient in ways that looked like nothing at all until they looked like everything. 3 petitions filed. A private citizen, no legal standing. The palace moved on. The morning bread still smelled the same. The cobblestones were still wet. The candles still burned down before the servants could replace them. Somewhere in the northern provinces, the countess's land produced its winter harvest. The numbers were good. She sent a copy of the figures to the Queen's taxation office, annotated in her careful hand, useful and precise and completely unremarkable. She was already thinking about spring.